Truly a historical and glorious day, and I am so proud and so pleased to be joining you here in Mobile, Alabama for this auspicious occasion. It was 5 years ago that one of our students was assigned the case of Rayfield Davis. At that time, all that was known about Mr. Davis came from a short article. It said that he had died after asserting to a white man that President Truman would improve the lives of African Americans. For that, the man to whom he had made the statement killed him right here.
To the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project from a full career as a civil rights advocate. I sat on the bench here for a number of years. This is the most rewarding work I've done in my career. The Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project really walks down two roads. In the first place, we collect data on cold cases, racial violence, homicidal racial violence from 1930 to 1970. Once you get to 1970, the cases are pretty well known. There's TV, there's lots of media coverage of these events. The real black hole in this field is 1930 to 1955. The second road really has to do with the families that were victimized by this violence. The families are seeking answers, and they deserve answers. And that's what our justice system is designed to do. When someone's been the victim of a crime like murder, it's for the justice system at any moment to provide those answers.
Our hearts jump with joy to notice that our first cousin, Rayfield Davis, and others' lives hadn't gone unnoticed. It's been a long time coming, 70 years. 70 years. Well, I grew up here all my life. I grew up on Tennessee Street. We had a normal childhood. One of my sisters recalled my mother speaking about she had a cousin that was killed at the railroad track. But it wasn't a topic in the house. All of our lives, we played in this ditch. Walked the railroad track alongside. So our blood runs through there.
The Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project operates like a law firm. We take 10 to 12 students every year in a clinic, and we provide them with the experience of pursuing a case, documenting a case, doing the fact investigation that builds a case file. This is experiential education. This is education in action. We add about 50 cases to the archive per year in the hope of building a complete archive of all of the murders of African Americans in the Jim Crow South.
Generally, we find our cases in the newspaper archives of the Black press. The articles that appear in the newspapers are sketchy and oftentimes incorrect, but they're a starting place. Once we identify a case, we then pass that on to a student, and from there, it's up to the student to reverse engineer the case, to figure out what happened, when it happened, who was involved, and equally importantly, what can be done now.
The first time that I heard of Rayfield Davis was when I saw his name in a book with a comma that said Mobile, Alabama. At that point, I didn't know what Mobile, Alabama meant. Maybe that was the place that he was born, maybe that was the place that he died, but it was somehow of significance to this individual. Part of what I spent a lot of time doing in the investigation is to look into local archives. Was this something that was documented by the police? Were there witnesses? Were there witness statements? Was the perpetrator ever found? Was he brought into court? Was there an arraignment? What happened in 1948 in Mobile? The first thing that I did was I wrote a FOIA to the Department of Justice and to the FBI. A FOIA is a Freedom of Information Act request, which says that I am asking for this particular information that should be of public record. I received back a letter months later that said we have no information on Rayfield Davis. I also looked for information on court records. I was able to get someone on the phone after several phone calls to try to figure out where documents from 1948 might be. Eventually was able to get someone on the phone that confirmed that files that were that old had been destroyed. When I asked how they had been destroyed, it was kind of I'm not sure. I know there's been a fire in the past. I'm sure things have been flooded in the past, which also made the investigation even tougher. Did the local newspapers in Mobile cover the murder of Rayfield Davis? That's where my biggest break was. We found a handful of articles from the Mobile newspaper from the day that the body was found through the following weeks and the process that happened after that. From those newspaper articles, I was able to pull witnesses, names. I was able to find an attorney that was involved. I was able to find investigators that were involved. It also told me where the murder took place. It told me where Rayfield Davis was living at the time of his murder. They named Horace Miller as the perpetrator, as the person that came in and confessed to the murder. With all of this evidence, including a full written confession, and the all-white grand jury fails to indict and says this is not murder. And in fact, this feels like an okay excuse as to why you beat this man to death. The first thought that I had was that I need to be able to find family of Rayfield Davis so that I can share the whole story and then get their input as to what feels like a next step that they wanted to be able to take.
How I found out about Rayfield Davis was 5 years ago. That was in 2013. We all met up at the Mobile Public Library. And then Chelsea told us about a murder that took place in 1948. I was like, wow, the facts that they had already gathered. At that time, they presented us with a family history, which really interested me, because I wanted to know more about him. So that's how I, started doing research, and because a lot of these things have been swept under the carpet. And that's the amazing part about it. You went from not knowing to knowing. Because you don't want your life to be a waste.
What we know about the night that Rayfield Davis was murdered is that he was riding the bus home, which was given to folks who worked at Brooklyn Air Force Base. We know that based on witness accounts that he got off the bus stop right down the street from where he lived. And we also know from witness accounts that Horace Miller followed him off the bus. Horace Miller should have gotten off a few bus stops down. His house wasn't where Rayfield Davis's was. We know that from Horace Miller's own account, Rayfield Davis says to him, hey, come over to my house and have a drink with me. I want to celebrate the fact that you and I are going to have equal rights someday under President Truman's proposed legislation. Come over and have a drink with me, and we'll celebrate that together. That enraged him to the point that he began to beat Rayfield Davis to death. He kicked him, he punched him until the point that he couldn't move. We also know, based on witness accounts, that he was left in a drainage ditch, and that when witnesses found him, he was still breathing and he was still warm. And so we know that Horace Miller left him there to die.
Rayfield Davis. He was a laborer in Brookfield. He was just an ordinary person. I read somewhere where he had saved some money. So, that goes to show you, he was a hard worker. He was supplying his needs to his family. So, from that's really all I know about him. Mm-hmm.
He was a human, like all of us, that wanted dignity and respect. And he was someone that was brave.
My son and I, a couple of months, went down to the site where Rayfield's body was. It kind of brought tears to my eyes because knowing that, my kinfolks was thrown in that ditch.
Part of why we want to investigate and try to find the victim's family as well as the perpetrator and/or the perpetrator's family is because part of the idea of restorative practices or restorative justice is to create also a space for dialogue. What separates this case from other cold cases that the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project works on is that in this case, the perpetrator is still alive.
The Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, we have in our archive about 500 cases that we have developed, for which we have materials and where we've identified family members. And we think there are probably somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 other cases out there. In some cases, we have found that perpetrators are still alive. Those are rare.
I thought that Horace Miller was still alive because I had his age from the newspaper article that said that he was 20 years old at the time that he murdered Rayfield. So I knew about how old he should be. I did a Google search. I found a name that was Horace, middle initial, last name, that I thought had matched, and also had an address for that person, which was all of an hour's drive from Mobile. And his phone number was listed on there as well. I went to Professor Burnham and I said, what do I do with this information? And she said, call him. What if I blew the one chance in calling this perpetrator, right? And so I remember dialoguing through on my own what I was gonna say if it went this way or if it went this way. Not only about what happened in 1948, but what he's thought about since. I called up Horace Miller to try to see if it was the same person that had been referenced in this case, and it sounded like it was. He was in his early 20s when he was living in Mobile in 1948. He answered affirmatively to that. You could hear presumably his significant other, his wife, in the background instructing him to hang up the phone, to hang up the phone, to hang up the phone.
The interesting thing about the Miller case is that he was arrested and he confessed. There's actually a written confession when the murder occurred. But he was never indicted. He went before a grand jury, and the grand jury failed to indict despite the confession. Horace Miller has never been tried for the murder of Rayfield Davis. Even though it happened a very long time ago, there is no statute of limitations on murder.
Even if we find the perpetrator is still alive, prosecutions are almost impossible because the prosecutor depends not on the word of the would-be defendant, but on other evidence that is now no longer available. So in the Davis case, for example, there is no one else, as far as we know, who would be able to give a prosecutor the evidence necessary to bring that case to a successful conclusion. Time erodes evidence.
Even though there's a written confession in this case, there still is forensic evidence, eyewitness evidence, other kinds of evidence to get it beyond a reasonable doubt. It's difficult to indict and bring a case against a man in his 80s or 90s. And there's often a desire for letting sleeping dogs lie.
I will never forget the first thing that Nichole said, and the rest of her family completely echoed this, was that they were a God-fearing people who believed that his judgment would come. But not only that, what they wanted was to be able to sit down with Horace Miller and to ask him, why'd you do this?
Growing up in a Christian family, you know, there's no condemnation that God won't forgive. There's no sin, you know, bigger or smaller than one another. So we was taught to forgive. And you know, I forgive him. You know, my family feel the same, but you know, there's also the side where, you know, this man has gone on with his life. Rayfield is in the grave. You know, he didn't have a prosperous life. You know, he doesn't have a proper headstone. You know, Horace Miller goes home on a soft pillow at night. We had offered the extent for Mr. Miller to be here, to extend to us that the seed that he sowed back then is no longer. He ignored the calls. But God still looks high and he looks low. We didn't get him, but we got his granddaughter. 70 years later, I was in my driveway and my cell phone messenger went off. I looked at it and I see this text. Is this the cousin of Rayfield Davis? And I said, yes, and you are. She mentioned that she had read an article from the Washington Post regarding the Rayfield Davis case. And she said she read about my first cousin and her granddad. And I'm like confused. I say, are you kin of Rayfield Davis or Horace Miller? She said, Horace. And it just seemed like my heart just dropped. And you know, I just started, you know, just looking up at the sky, just the tears wanted to fall because this was my prayer. And she said, I felt that I needed to call. She said, we need closure. She said, my granddaddy only gave us a little information that he was in an altercation back in the days, and that was it. Not a man was killed, not going to trial and writing a confession letter, none of that. Just that he had an altercation back in the day. She felt like she needed to make an apology. And it reads like this. We were both seeking answers to questions we had had for so many years. I now understand why the full truth was not given, why my family never spoke of it, and why this unfortunate incident was kept a dark secret. Mr. Rayfield Davis and his wife, Miss Sherry, will no longer be forgotten in my life, my family lives. Everyone deserves equality and respect. No wife, parent, sister, brother, or child should lose a loved one due to a difference of opinion and or color of one's skin. My grandfather's offsprings and their offsprings, followed by their offspring, do not share the same racial viewpoints. I can only hope one day my father, my daughter, my niece, and my nephews will live in a world where universal mindset of ignorance will no longer exist. I can only hope that one day we will have the chance to meet you and your loved ones. It will be an honor to know the family behind a man who holds a strong, dynamic bloodline to keep his name alive for generations to come. May peace be with you all. This is sincerely from Nichole Miller Moreland. She's the granddaughter of Horace Miller. And she said, I can tell you this, that none of his offspring has that in their heart. Matter of fact, both of his daughters have married African-American men. But you know, I just thank God, after 70 years, it's okay. It's okay. Amen. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go on and reveal the name of the street. To Mr. Rayfield Davis family, this is just the beginning of justice for Mr. Davis.
Thank you, God.
I think I will forever feel a certain connection to Rayfield Davis, someone that I have never met and will never be able to meet. The work that I do today, I represent kids in court that are charged with crimes that can't afford an attorney. I wouldn't be doing this work if it wasn't for the work that I did at the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project.
But seeing his life not forgotten, if it's just a little sign, I'll take it, because I didn't know anything about him 5 years ago. Didn't nobody know anything about him 5 years ago. Because normally a street, when they name it, has a purpose. Rayfield Davis, that'll question a young person, would research that to find out what happened. By that sign being there, you know, you could pass by there and remember the story. Rayfield Davis.
These 6 Mobile cases are about resistance. We're here honoring these men, not just for what they did and the sacrifice they gave, but for what they represent and for the thousands in whose name they died. That story, we haven't finished telling it. We're only scraping the surface of that story. We owe that story to those who come behind us. And if we don't do this work, if we don't discover the Rayfield Davises of the world, it won't get discovered.
I wanted to meet Mr. Horace just to have the conversation with him to see if his demeanor about the opposite race is still the same today. I would say, I would ask him, how is your feeling towards the African-American race? Can I sit down at your dinner table and have dinner with you? Would you invite me?